Berserk is known to be a pretty good story by most people. Don't get me wrong, I even love it. I like it a lot. But it's not perfect, obviously. Like any other story, it has flaws. And the thing is, people don't talk often about these flaws, which is why I am going to talk about. And now you might think you know what I'm going to talk about, like something in the boat arc, which, yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of the boat arc, but it's not that bad. It's not horrible, right? It's okay. It's definitely the worst arc in Berserk, but it's not horrible. It's not. It doesn't contain the worst chapter in Berserk. Now that words go to chapter 363, the most recent Berserk chapter. And now you might say, "Oh well, you're just biased because it's recent, so you don't really know about other Berserk chapter which are bad, right?" Well, to that, maybe, perhaps, I guess there could be other bad chapters, like in the boat arc, but no, this chapter is just bad, and the biggest reason for that is because it's pointless. So I'm gonna go over it a bit in this video because I just need to show you just how pointless it is. Because if it was cut from the story, it wouldn't change a thing. Even in 10 years, if it was cut from the story, it wouldn't change a thing. Although, I will admit that the fact that this is the most recent chapter does make me more angry towards this chapter because it's just even more frustrating, man. Now, the biggest problem this chapter has is that it goes nowhere and it tells us nothing new. And no, a cliffhanger doesn't count, okay? I'm gonna go over that a bit later, okay? So basically, it starts with a recap. The first few pages are about what basically happened in chapter 362, which is fine, most manga do this. They have their early pages and chapters basically recapping what happened in the previous chapter. So this is technically fine if that was all there was, right? And yeah, it elaborates a bit on the ideas of chapter 362, but not in a major way. It's not really new. It's just rewording, which is fine, again, if that was it. But that's not it, obviously. There's nothing else in this chapter. This is basically the best dialogue you got in the chapter, and that's really disappointing. But what the most disappointing thing is, obviously, the comedy. Because after this recap, we go on to the comedy with Isidro and the gang, and this is where I talk about comedy in Berserk. And listen, I don't sit down and read Berserk to get a good laugh, right? And now comedy in Berserk is not all bad. I'd say the early comedy in Berserk is fairly fine. But that's because there's a big difference with the early comedy in Berserk and the post-Millennium Falcon arc comedy, because it's completely changed. Now, early on in Berserk, most of the comedy comes from the dialogue, and just a little bit from the image. But nowadays, the comedy is entirely visual. It's basically everybody has their own version of Chestnut Puck in their head, and it just doesn't work because this completely breaks the tone. The thing about comedy that's centered around dialogue is that it doesn't affect the tone of the story as much because it's subtle, but visual comedy isn't. And chapter 363 has some of the worst visual comedy I've seen in Berserk. It is just so boring and bad, and it's childish, really. It has comedy that really doesn't fit here. And, well, that's certainly disappointing. But on top of that, the comedy doesn't bring us anywhere. It doesn't have a point. Again, this whole chapter is pointless. That's basically everything I'm gonna say. And yeah, that's frustrating, and that won't be fixed over time. Now, the next section of the chapter isn't as frustrating, but it certainly doesn't have a point. It's, again, a recapping dialogue. It just puts it into different words, right? It's about recapping that Guts has a struggle between his hatred for Griffith and his love for Casca, and that's all the discussion brings us to. It's just reminding us that that's the point of the story. But this discussion doesn't have a point. We already knew that. It just, this time it's in our face. It's like, there, do you see it? Do you see it? That's the story, alright? If not, you're just blind, right? And yeah, That's the chapter. That's all there is of content in this chapter. Recaps and shitty comedy that brings us nowhere. And now I'm gonna talk about the cliffhanger, because the cliffhanger admittedly is good. But again, a cliffhanger isn't content. It's basically telling people to subscribe at the end of the video. It's fine, I don't have a problem with it, but it's not content, because if we took out this cliffhanger from chapter 363 and put it onto chapter 362, it would only make chapter 362 better, because, well, it doesn't really have a cliffhanger, but that's another discussion. So yeah, the fact that the Moonlight Child arrives on Alpha Island does not matter for this chapter. It's just a cliffhanger. We get nothing, okay? Nothing. And the thing that's the most frustrating is that there's no defense for this. Yeah, it will be less annoying when more chapters come out, when you reread Berserk. This chapter, it won't be that big of a deal, but it will be pointless. Because this chapter is pointless, and it will always be pointless. And the thing is, as a Berserk fan, you deserve better than this. You do. You deserve better than this, okay? Basically, every time we talk about Berserk, our one excuse as Berserk fan for the delay of chapters is quality. That we have quality of the highest level in terms of the story, in terms of the art, but right now, this chapter wasn't better than most manga chapters. Like, you actually need to actively search for a worse chapter, and I'm sure you're gonna find it. There's worse thing in life than this chapter, but the fact that you have to search for something worse, that's a problem, because as a Berserk fan, we have to expect quality and high quality, but now we wait 5 months for a filler chapter? Hell no! What the fuck? What the fuck? And now we have to wait another 6 months with a cliffhanger on top. That's just frustrating and infuriating, and as a Berserk fan, you should be outraged. Really. Well, whatever. I hope you enjoyed the video.